I didn't expect the work holiday party to expose everything wrong with my job in one night. I had been in the service industry long enough to know that holiday parties were never really about celebrating the holidays. They were about pressure, release, about resentment finding oxygen, about people who smiled through double shifts suddenly being handed an open bar and a reason to stop pretending. But this one was supposed to be different. At least that was the lie management told us, and the one I briefly believed. I worked as a senior floor manager for a restaurant group that liked to call itself hospitality forward and experience driven, which really just meant we ran high-volume restaurants with thin margins and even thinner patience for anyone who couldn't keep up. We had 6 locations across the city, everything from upscale casual to late-night chaos, and once a year they pulled us all into one room and pretended we were a family. The holiday party was held in the private event space above one of our flagship restaurants. Polished concrete floors, exposed brick, and industrial lighting dimmed just enough to feel intentional. The kind of place corporate loved because it photographed well. The kind of place servers hated because spills echoed and nothing was forgiving. I arrived early like I always did. Old habits die hard. Managers show up before the staff, check the layout, and scan for problems before they happen. Vivian was already there. She stood near the bar, coat still on, phone in her hand, and her expression calm in the way that only came from someone who had learned to keep her emotions folded neatly inside. She worked in corporate operations, technically above me on the org chart, but she never acted like it. We'd known each other for 3 years, bonded over shared exhaustion and the strange intimacy that came from surviving the same mess from different angles. She looked relieved when she saw me, which told me more about the night ahead than any email ever could. The bar staff were setting up trays of glasses. The DJ was testing sound levels, bass thumping just enough to rattle nerves. Decorations were minimal. Someone had decided that subtle was festive. By the time the first wave arrived, the energy shifted. Service industry people don't trickle in, they flood. Servers, bartenders, line cooks, hosts, assistant managers, regional managers, corporate HR, marketing people who had never worked a double shift in their lives. Holiday sweaters mixed with black button-downs, cheap perfume and expensive cologne fighting for dominance in the air. Everyone acting like this was optional, while clearly treating it like a test. Drinks started flowing fast. That was the first mistake. The second mistake was inviting everyone together. Corporate had wanted unity. What they got was proximity. I watched as cliques formed almost instantly. Kitchen staff clustered near the windows, laughing too loud. Corporate gathered near the center, drinks held carefully and smiles practiced. Servers gravitated toward the bar, already ordering like it was last call, and then there was the man who would become the problem. His name was Grant. He was a regional director, 2 levels above me, and was the kind of guy who talked about culture, while quietly burning people out. He arrived late, coat tossed over one arm, with confidence spilling off him like he owned the room. I clocked the way people stiffened when they noticed him, the way laughter dipped and then recovered. Grant had a reputation. He wasn't openly cruel. That would have been easier to deal with. He was passive, strategic, and always plausible. The kind of manager who never raised his voice but somehow made you feel small anyway. The kind who remembered mistakes forever and favors only when it benefited him. I noticed him watching Vivian. At first, I told myself I was projecting. But then I saw the way he angled his body when she moved, and how his eyes followed her in a way that didn't match the casual nods he gave everyone else. Vivian noticed too. She always did. She moved closer to me without saying anything, a subtle shift that spoke volumes. We didn't need words. We'd both learned how to read rooms like weather patterns. As the night wore on, the volume rose. Drinks stacked as someone spilled red wine on the concrete and laughed like it was charming. The DJ leaned harder into throwback hits, and suddenly people were dancing who had never danced together before. That's when the drama started to ferment. Grant made his way through the crowd, drink always full and his smile always just a little too knowing. He stopped to talk to managers, then servers, then back to corporate, collecting information like currency. When he finally approached Vivian, I felt it before I saw it. He positioned himself between her and the bar, forcing her to either engage or leave. She stayed polite and professional, her expression carefully neutral. I hovered close enough to intervene without making it obvious. Grant laughed louder than necessary. He said something I couldn't hear over the music. Vivian just smiled thinly and nodded once. Then he glanced at me. The look he gave wasn't hostile, it was amused, like I was something mildly inconvenient. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. That was mistake number 3. Because in the service industry, silence is often permission. By the time the party hit its midpoint, the room felt different, heavier. People had crossed whatever internal line kept them pretending this was just a work event. The alcohol had done what it always did. It stripped away restraint while amplifying every unresolved grievance. Laughter came easier, but so did side-eye glances and half-formed complaints. I kept moving, drifting from group to group under the guise of checking in, though there was nothing for me to manage. Old instincts again. When things felt unstable, I needed motion. Stillness felt like negligence. Vivian stayed near the perimeter now, nursing her drink instead of refilling it. I could tell she was tracking the same thing I was. The subtle shift in Grant's behavior. The way he'd started inserting himself into conversations that weren't his. The way he laughed when someone said something reckless instead of redirecting it. At some point, a server from one of our busiest locations started venting loudly near the bar, about schedules, about favoritism, about burnout, things that were true but dangerous when spoken in this setting. Grant didn't shut it down, instead he leaned in. That was when I realized what he was doing. He wasn't losing control of the room, he was testing it. Every complaint was a thread he could pull later. Every overheard grievance was leverage. He asked questions that sounded supportive but were actually prompts. He nodded sympathetically while mentally filing names away. The corporate people didn't notice. They were too busy congratulating themselves on how fun the night was. I caught Vivian watching him from across the room, her jaw set in a way I'd only seen when she was already planning damage control. She caught my eye and gave a small shake of her head. We both knew escalation would look bad, especially coming from her, especially in front of him. Grant eventually drifted back toward us, drink replaced again without him ever going to the bar. He stood too close. The music dipped between songs, and his voice suddenly carried. He made a comment about how hard it must be for Vivian to balance corporate expectations with real-world pressure. He said it with a smile like it was a compliment, like it wasn't loaded. Vivian responded with practiced calmness and neutrality. I said nothing. That silence sat wrong in my chest, but I told myself it was strategic, that calling him out here would only give him something to twist later. That restraint was the smarter move. Then he crossed the line. He leaned in slightly and said something low, something meant only for her. And I watched Vivian's expression change, not into anger, but into stillness. The kind that comes when someone decides they've seen enough. She stepped away from him without a word. Grant watched her go, then looked at me again. This time, the amusement was sharper. I felt the weight of it then. The frustration. The helplessness of knowing exactly what kind of person he was and exactly how protected he felt being that person in a room full of witnesses who didn't quite see enough. The party continued around us like nothing had happened. Someone started a chant near the DJ booth. Someone else knocked over a chair. Phones came out. Stories were being recorded that would live far longer than this night. I found Vivian near the coat rack, her posture composed and her breathing controlled. She didn't look upset. She looked resolved. She told me, quietly, that she was done pretending this was harmless. Not with emotion, with certainty. We both knew that meant this night wasn't going to end quietly anymore. And Grant, whether he realized it or not, had just made a mistake he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of. After Vivian stepped away, the room didn't notice. That was the part that stayed with me, the way everything kept moving as if nothing significant had happened. Music pulsed, drinks clinked. Someone laughed hard enough to bend forward at the waist. The party carried on, indifferent to the fact that a line had been crossed so casually it almost disappeared. I followed Vivian, but not immediately. I needed distance first in order to watch Grant. He didn't chase her or look rattled. He took a slow sip of his drink and turned back to the group near him, slipping effortlessly into conversation like he hadn't just exposed himself to someone who knew better. That was his real skill, not manipulation, but plausible deniability. He thrived in environments like this because everything blurred just enough to protect him. People remembered vibes instead of specifics. And if anything did come back to him, later it would sound small when retold. I'd seen it happen before. Complaints that evaporated once they reached corporate. Stories softened until they sounded like misunderstandings. Careers quietly redirected. Vivian wasn't naive. She knew all of this, which meant she was already thinking several steps ahead. Found her by the balcony doors, looking out over the street below. The city lights reflected off the glass, giving her face a distant, almost unreal quality. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't pacing. She was still. That scared me more than anger would have. She didn't say anything when I joined her. Her body language said enough. She was cataloging the night and filing away details. Grant, meanwhile, escalated. Not directly toward her again, but outward. He got bolder. He started telling half-true stories about past problem employees and difficult personalities, framed as cautionary tales but laced with just enough detail that anyone listening could connect dots. I watched faces change as people realized they were hearing warnings disguised as jokes. The drinks didn't help. Someone from marketing tripped and knocked into a server, who snapped back sharper than necessary. A manager laughed instead of intervening. A cook said something crude that should have been shut down immediately, but wasn't. Standards were slipping. Grant noticed because he thrived on it. At some point, he positioned himself near the DJ booth, like a host presiding over the chaos. People gravitated toward him without realizing why. Authority does that. Even drunk authority. I caught fragments as I passed by. Complaints about scheduling favoritism. Accusations of managers protecting certain employees. Jokes about HR being useless. Every sentence led to another loose thread. I felt the familiar frustration rise, the kind that made my jaw tighten and my hands curl slightly at my sides. The knowledge that this night would be dissected later by people who hadn't been here, hadn't felt the energy, hadn't seen the way Grant's presence warped everything around him. And then it happened. Grant cornered a junior manager near the bar, someone new, someone eager, someone who'd already had too much to drink. He leaned in close, nodding along as the guy vented openly about Vivian, about corporate pressure and unrealistic expectations. I watched it unfold in slow motion. Grant didn't defend her. He didn't redirect. He didn't stop the conversation. He encouraged it. That was when I moved. I didn't confront him. Instead, I positioned myself close enough to be seen. Close enough that if this came back later, my presence would matter. Grant clocked me instantly. He smiled again with that same amused look. And for the first time that night, I realized he thought he was untouchable. The party crossed a threshold after that. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because restraint finally collapsed. People who had been careful earlier stopped checking themselves. Phones came out more freely as stories got louder and complaints got sharper. Grant stayed exactly where he wanted to be, central, visible, unchallenged. Vivian re-entered the room with purpose. She didn't confront him. She didn't avoid him either. She began moving deliberately through the space, engaging just enough to be present, to be seen, to be remembered. She spoke to people who mattered. People who noticed details, who would later compare notes. I mirrored her from the other side. We weren't coordinating openly, but we didn't have to. Years in this industry taught you how to act without signaling, how to document behavior without pulling out a notebook. Grant made another mistake. He drank too much. His confidence tipped into carelessness. His voice rose and his jokes got sharper. He started saying things that assumed agreement instead of earning it. He made a comment about how some people used policy as a shield when they couldn't handle pressure. He glanced toward Vivian when he said it, and this time, others noticed. I saw it in the pause that followed. In the way a few people exchanged looks. In the way someone laughed a beat too late. The room didn't turn on him, but the spell cracked. Grant brushed past a server carrying a tray and didn't apologize when drinks sloshed dangerously close to spilling. The server steadied herself, clearly irritated, and said something under her breath. Grant stopped and turned. He stared at her, long enough to make the moment uncomfortable. Then he smiled and said something I couldn't hear, but I saw her expression fall and the color drain from her face. She nodded quickly and retreated. That did it. Not for the room, but for me. The frustration crystallized into clarity. This wasn't about one comment to Vivian. This wasn't even about tonight alone. This was about a pattern that had survived because people like me stayed quiet in moments like this, telling ourselves it was strategic. I stepped forward, not aggressively, but just enough to break the bubble he'd built around himself. Grant looked surprised. The music swelled again, drowning out whatever words were exchanged, but words weren't the point. Presence was. I didn't accuse him or escalate. I simply made it impossible for him to continue unchecked. And for the first time all night, he adjusted. He stepped back, his posture shifted, and his smile became tighter. Power hates friction. The rest of the party continued in a strange, uneasy equilibrium. Grant stayed visible but subdued. Vivian remained composed and observant. I stayed close. Enough to both to make the dynamic clear. By the time coats started being collected and rides called, the damage was already done. People would remember this night and all of the moments where lines were crossed and not entirely ignored. Vivian would remember everything, and so would I. The party didn't end with a bang. It ended the way most service industry nights do, with people slipping out in uneven waves, coats half-buttoned, laughter thinning into tired smiles, and ride shares, piling up outside while the music kept playing for an audience that no longer existed. That was the irony of it. After all that tension, all that quiet damage, the end felt almost mundane. Grant lingered longer than most. He stayed near the bar, posture relaxed again, laughing with two corporate managers who looked too tipsy to be forming memories. He acted like a man who believed he'd weathered the night, like the earlier friction had already dissolved into nothing. Vivian moved differently now. She made a slow circuit through the room, thanking people for coming, checking in on staff who looked overwhelmed, and offering small, steady moments of professionalism that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had unfolded. Each interaction left an impression. I stayed nearby, not hovering, just present. I noticed how often people looked between us, as if subconsciously linking us together as a unit. Stability does that. It attracts attention simply by existing. Grant finally approached again, this time with caution layered under charm. His tone shifted, his smile recalibrated. He spoke as if nothing earlier had happened, as if the night had unfolded exactly as planned. Vivian didn't confront him. She didn't even acknowledge the tension. She treated him like a colleague whose behavior had been observed and logged, not challenged. I saw his unease in his micro-expressions, the brief tightening around his eyes and the way his confidence wavered just slightly when she didn't react. The way he expected. He'd spent the entire night asserting dominance through implication and access. Now he had neither. As people filtered out, staff began cleaning around us. Empty glasses stacked and decorations peeled away. The room slowly reverted from party to workplace, and with it came the unspoken understanding that what happened here didn't stay here. Grant left without saying goodbye. Vivian and I stayed until the end, until the DJ shut down and the lights came up fully, exposing the room for what it was: scuffed floors, smeared glass, and discarded coats. The illusion was gone. Outside, the cold hit sharp and clean. The city moved on like nothing significant had occurred, but I felt lighter in a strange way. The worst part of dealing with people like Grant isn't the behavior itself. It's the uncertainty afterward. That was gone now. Vivian documented everything before the night was even over. She recalled patterns, witnesses, and the exact phrasing of comments she could remember clearly. I followed up the next morning with my own account. I described behavior and context without embellishment. Others did the same. Not because we rallied together or staged anything, but because once someone breaks the illusion of safety, people realize how much they've been tolerating. Grant walked into work the following week like nothing had changed. That was his final miscalculation. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived in meetings Grant wasn't invited to and in conversations that stopped when he entered the room. He sensed it before it was confirmed. Power relies on feedback loops, and his had gone quiet. The investigation, if you could even call it that, was methodical. Exactly the kind that can't be dismissed as reactive or emotional. Vivian wasn't leading it publicly, but her fingerprints were everywhere. No single complaint would have been enough, but patterns don't argue. Grant attempted course correction. He became suddenly polite and cautious. He reached out to people he'd previously ignored, trying to reframe himself as collaborative. Misunderstood. But it didn't work. Once people see behind the curtain, they don't forget. The official outcome came quietly. A mutual decision. A shift in leadership priorities. Language was carefully chosen to protect the company while removing the liability. Grant was gone within a month. The service industry moved on the way it always does. Schedules still needed filling. Restaurants still opened and closed. But something fundamental had shifted. People stood a little straighter, managers intervened sooner, and corporate listened more carefully, if only because they understood now how quickly silence could turn into documentation. Vivian stayed. She didn't celebrate or take credit. She returned to work with the same composure she'd carried through that entire night, but there was a subtle change, an authority rooted not in title, but in proven integrity. As for me, I learned something. I should have known already. That frustration doesn't disappear when you swallow it. It just waits. That realism doesn't mean resignation. And that sometimes, the most satisfying ending isn't loud or public or dramatic. It's watching someone who believed they were untouchable realize, too late, that they were only ever protected by other people's silence. That holiday party became legend in the way these things do. Stories were softened, sharpened, and retold. But the truth stayed intact where it mattered.